Hello, souls and demons. Today, I have 3 wonderfully written stories that I'm going to bring forth to you today. So just sit back, relax, grip your seats, and enjoy yourselves. Today's first story is written by Deeify, called The Missed Call. Another sleepless night had arrived as I stared blankly into my computer monitor. I lazily browsed through gaming streams, YouTube videos, and funny memes. Insomnia hit me hard tonight as I tried desperately to relax my mind, but found myself caught up in the endless digital world called the internet. An unexpected sight was seen from the corner of my eye. The small LED light on my phone was blinking, indicating I had a notification. What kind of notification could I be receiving this deep into the night? I grabbed my phone and lit up the screen. 1 missed call. Strange. I didn't hear it ring. This late, I usually have it on vibrate, but with it sitting on my desk, I usually could not only hear it, but feel it through the vibrations resonating through my desktop. I was confused, but I dialed the number back. The call rang several times as I patiently waited for an answer. Just as I figured it was going to go to voicemail, a clicking sound was heard. Hello? A female voice groggily answered on the other end. Hi, I awkwardly replied. Sorry if I'm bugging you, but I just got a missed call from your phone number. I'm sorry, hon, but that can't be right. I'm asleep in bed and nowhere near my phone, she replied sluggishly as I clearly woke her up. I began to feel bad that I'd woken up this poor elderly woman. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Maybe it was just a weird hiccup with my phone, I apologize, I said, placing my hand on my forehead in embarrassment. Quite all right, sweetheart. Have a good night, she said in a lighthearted tone. We said our goodbyes, and I was a tad relieved she wasn't too terribly upset with me. Still, I was a bit embarrassed. I continued my internet love affair and all but put the awkward call out of my mind when another indicator light flashed on my phone. 1 missed call. What the hell? I whispered to myself. Confusion hit me as I clicked on the notification. It was the same number. The same number I'd missed earlier from the elderly lady's phone. I pondered if I should just call back. Maybe she figured out what happened and wanted to let me know. I called back. Hello? A familiar voice said, a little more sternly this time. I'm sorry, ma'am. I just got another missed call from you. Did you try calling me back? I said, trying to sound as innocent as possible as to not frighten this poor woman. My dear, I have not touched my phone since we last spoke. Now please, I have a very early day tomorrow and really need my rest, she sternly replied. Again, I apologize. Good night, ma'am, I replied, once again placing my hand on my forehead. The sight hit me once more. Several minutes passed and another indicator light on my phone was blinking at me, almost mocking me. 1 missed call. It was the same number again. I let out a sigh and put my phone back on the desk. This time I turned my ringtone on to see if I could hear it next time. I did. A quick beep was heard followed by silence. 2 missed calls. I stared at my phone waiting for another call. A few more minutes passed as I stared with my finger close to the screen, ready to pounce on the next call. My reflexes kicked in as the phone lit up with the same number calling me. Hello? I quickly answered. Shuffling was heard in the background as I repeated my greeting twice more. Nothing. Her phone must be dialing on its own, like some sort of glitch. I hung up. Almost as soon as I hung up, it began ringing again. I quickly answered. Hey, hello? Ma'am, can you hear me? Your phone is... I was interrupted by another sound. At what I could only imagine was the other end of the room. I heard the snores of who I assumed was the elderly lady, but closer to the phone, I heard a voice. Mine. You belong to me. No more pain. Your pain is almost over. The pain of life. You will thank me. A raspy, deep voice was heard saying. Who is this? I yelled into the phone. No answer. A small laugh was heard from the same voice. I began to panic. Someone was in this old lady's house. Was this man calling me to hear whatever he has planning? I hung up and moved to call the police. Mid-dial, my phone lit up with the same number. I answered again. The same man's ramblings were heard, more of the same, about life and pain. This person was clearly troubled. I opened my mouth to speak, but was interrupted by another voice. This voice, however, had a much different inflection. 4, 2, 6, 7. The soft, feminine voice said quietly. The voice was almost seductive as she spoke. Wait, what? Who are you? 4, 2, 6, 7? What is this? I asked in a panic. Click. The call hung up again. 4267. What was the voice trying to tell me? Was that another prisoner of this psychotic man? As if on cue, my phone once again awoke, with the same phone number staring back from the screen. I answered. More of this disturbed man's whispering rants could be heard, only they were further away and barely audible. He was moving towards the elderly woman. I began to panic at the realization. The street. A soft, feminine voice was heard again. Oh, what? I asked, confused. The street of hope, she slowly replied. I don't know what you're... I stopped what I was saying as I realized what this could mean. The call ended on my phone as I couldn't believe what it was implying. The street of hope. 1 block away from my house was Hope Street. A quick glance on my maps program showed me the address, 4267 Hope Street. I was close. I picked up my phone, but this time, I was not calling the elderly woman's number back. I was phoning the police. After trying to make my story as believable as possible, blaming it on a butt dial, I managed to get them to head to her house. Sirens and flashing lights were soon heard from the neighborhood across the way. I couldn't see what was happening, just the blue and red lights. An hour later, there was a knocking at my door. It was the police. In conducting a search of her house, the police were able to apprehend a mentally unstable man who had just escaped from a local psychiatric hospital. He was branding a small steak knife from the woman's kitchen. My mind raced as I remembered the other person in the house who gave me the address. They were confused as only the deranged man and elderly woman were found in the house. They did find her cell phone on the other side of the room from where she was sleeping. When the police searched her phone to verify my story, there was an unsent text. A text that was being sent to my number. The text simply read, "It's not time yet." This next story is quite a good one. It's Why the Dead Don't Come Back by Objective Tell 6047. Enjoy. So I think you know the drill by now. Sit back, grip your seats, and enjoy. Why the Dead Don't Come Back. My name is Jacob Evans. I work for a large pharmaceutical company. If you're reading this, if this account survives, then something has happened to me. This is my last confession, and I want to make one thing perfectly clear. There's a reason the dead don't come back. No matter how much you want your loved ones back to life, trust me, you are better off letting them rest in peace. I brought my wife back from the dead, and I regret what I did. Now I'll get to the point. My company has made a product that is supposed to restore brain and respiratory activity in dead subjects. I have seen it work in lab rats and other animals. To my knowledge, they did begin human trials, but I was never able to see any records. It was around this time that I was unsuccessfully able to check the reports that I got the news that my wife got into a car wreck. She had been rammed by an oncoming vehicle going 2 or 3 times the speed limit. I tried to get to the hospital as quick as I could, but it was too late. She had been declared dead just minutes before I got there. I had demanded to see her. Reluctantly, they showed her to me, and the damage she had suffered. Shards of glass could be found in her chest, and her face as well as her eyes. Her torso had been covered in bruises. The biggest wound was a gash going across her skull where a loose piece of metal had impaled her head. The large wound had exposed her skull and brain. It had been the toughest day for me when I buried my wife. She had been the best thing that ever happened to me, and I couldn't let her go. After burying her, I asked my coworker and friend about the human testing on reanimation. He had been working closely with them. He couldn't tell me anything, as he signed a disclosure agreement. With no one able to tell me anything, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Before leaving work, I had managed to take a sample with me without being caught. The sample was an inky black substance with the consistency of watery mud. The smell it gave off was the mixture of smoke and tar fumes. Stealing the sample was somehow the easy part, despite putting myself in all kinds of trouble for it. The hardest part, at least physically, was going to the cemetery after dark to exhume my wife's body. It was a quiet street that night and far from any house, so I could sneak my wife out of there without being noticed. I drove us back to the house and I carried her down to the basement, which now served as the personal lab. I strapped my wife to the cold steel table with a single light bulb shining above her, the light reflecting off her pale body. I hooked an IV bag full of the concoction to her arm. I also hooked up an EEG monitor to watch for a sign of brain activity as well as a heart monitor. The only other piece of equipment I had on hand was a defibrillator to restore heart activity. I began the procedure by injecting the liquid into her veins. Slowly but surely, it made its way into her bloodstream until the bag emptied. I took the defibrillator and tried to restore my wife's heartbeat. No signs on the EEG monitor. I had continued this for minutes and eventually hours, alternating between jump-starting her heart and giving CPR. 3 hours passed. No sign of life could be detected, no matter how much I tried. My efforts were rewarded with the unresponsive corpse of my wife, total exhaustion and despair. In my exhausted state, I went back upstairs and to my lonely bedroom and collapsed onto the mattress. Sleep overcame me in an instant. I woke up to the sound of metallic clang coming from the kitchen, followed by the sound of boxes dropping to the floor. Sluggishly, I got out of bed to investigate the noise and made my way to the kitchen. Switching on the light had exposed pots and open cereal boxes on the floor. The sound of dry cereal crunching under my feet echoed through what I thought was an empty house. The next room was the living room, darkened with no lights on. I walked through the kitchen, making sure not to step on dried cornflakes and Captain Crunch. There were no discernible shapes in the living room except for the furniture and the window. I reached for the light switch. My wife was sitting on the sofa, in a slouched position, still in the dress she was buried in. She didn't acknowledge the light turning on. I was overjoyed seeing my wife alive. I walked to her, meeting her at eye level to get her attention. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I gently nudged her, and she finally met my eyes. Her gash in her skull still visible to me. There were two things that caught my attention as she looked at me. First, the smell of decomposition and soil wafted heavily in the air. I could taste it. The smell seemed to have contaminated the air around her. The second detail I noticed was that my wife's eyes didn't have the lovely shine they did before. Instead, they were just two dull black holes devoid of any light. I asked her to say something, and the only response she could give was a deep moaning sound, deeper than her sweet voice used to be. I decided to ignore all of this and helped my wife to the bathroom so I could bathe her. I washed her, attempting to wash the foul odor off of her body. Her joints were stiff, her hand and forearm curling upwards. She needed some help getting in and out of the tub. Her body was cold all over, like ice. Her hair was a tangled mess of dried blood from the dried blood coming from her head wound. It still didn't heal. She was silent the whole time I bathed her. After her bath, I took her to bed with me. I couldn't get the stench off of her. I wanted to give her a kiss goodnight, but the smell was overpowering and stopped me from getting close. So I quietly turned around so I wouldn't have to smell her. As far as I could tell, she was still lying on her back, staring into the ceiling. I want to say that things went well after that. I want to be able to say that she turned back into the woman I fell in love with. I want to say we had our happily ever after. I want to say that, but I can't. No. Things didn't get better after that. In fact, things only got worse. I would find her sitting with her vacant expression at random spots throughout the house. When she did move, it was an awkward walk like a choppy animation. Her limbs were still stiff with rigor mortis. Sometimes she'd be in her backyard, looking at nothing. The police had come to my house to question me about my wife's gravesite. They told me her grave was dug up and her body missing from the casket. When I answered them, there was a loud clatter coming from the basement. I told them sometimes my cat makes a mess of things around the house. The police took my statement and left while I checked downstairs. My wife had destroyed the equipment I used to resurrect her. She was also hard to feed. If I was trying to feed her, she would refuse anything I offered. I also bathed her every night, trying to get the smell off of her. It never did. If she ever spoke, it would be her groans and grunts. Those were the days I could handle her. As the days passed, her behavior became more erratic. Later, I would start to find broken dishes and glass all over the place. The frames of our wedding pictures were busted. Not as disturbing as when I found her carving a scar on her cheek with a piece of our mirror. And that damn smell of death hung everywhere she was, including on our furniture. It stuck there no matter how hard I scrubbed it out. One night I was trying to feed her, but she was being belligerent. I asked her to please eat something, but she threw the plate of food across the room. I had enough of her acting out, so I left her in our room that night, locking her in like a child in timeout. I hated myself for doing it, but I needed a break. Plus, I just wanted one night of not being around that foul odor of rotting flesh. She was in there all night, moving around and clawing at the walls while I heard her noises from the sofa. She made a few noises that night, not her groans or grunts. She was laughing, which was more like a high-pitched cackling that caused me to feel nausea at the unnatural tone of it. I went to work the next day to get answers from my work friend. I told him everything I did and everything that happened. He responded with a look of absolute horror. That was when he told me what happened during human trials, despite his promise of never revealing the details. The subjects were a mix of convicts who died behind bars and psychiatric patients who likewise died. While the concoction did reanimate dead subjects, they displayed unusual side effects ranging from unresponsiveness to violent tendencies. Even those who were otherwise considered non-violent in life had started attacking others unprovoked. Sometimes they even injured themselves, like my wife did. Another side effect, which matched my wife completely, was the constant smell of decomposing flesh around them. All subjects were deemed non-functional and euthanized, and everyone on the project was either fired or signed disclosure agreements. The records of human trials were sealed away. This, he told me, is what I had to do to set things right. He gave me a glass vial of potassium chloride, enough to stop my wife's heartbeat. I left dumbfounded. How could I kill my own wife? I had returned home to find my wife breaking another mirror in our bedroom. She turned to me with eyes that were once lifeless, but now filled with intense, homicidal rage. She screamed at me and charged at me with a large piece of glass. The poison I had in my hand dropped to the floor and the glass vial broke upon impact. I fled the room while she chased me as fast as she could on her stiff limbs. She was still surprisingly quick. I ran all around the house trying to give her the slip, but she was always on my tail. I tried going out the backyard and moving the patio furniture to block her way. It gave me a little time, but I took it. I sneaked back in through the front door and found a hiding spot in our storage closet, which is where I am right now, recording this last confession. I understand why the dead aren't supposed to come back. It's a traumatizing experience to forcefully come back when you're supposed to rest in peace. I should have let my wife rest. Now, my wife... No. I have to stop calling that thing my wife. It was never her. That thing is stalking the house, looking for me. Each time she passes the closet, I fear she has found me, but she moves on, clutching the large piece of glass. If this record survives, I want everyone to let your loved ones rest in peace. I should have, but I was too selfish. I broke the natural order and now I'm going to pay the price. It's outside the door. It knows where I am. The door is opening. I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry for what I did. Please forgive me. God help. Alright, well, the third story I have for you today is I Thought This Never Happened, written by Leah of Alexandria. 5109 Rosebush Lane. For 22 years, I have made myself believe this disturbing series of events did not happen to me. I have successfully convinced myself that this was all imagined. Our minds and souls have an amazing ability to protect us from psychological damage. Then I spoke with a friend that I haven't seen in a long time. The same friend I allegedly experienced this event with. He confirmed the whole thing. I'll do my best to accurately present the entire story, as raw as it happened. And apparently it did happen. This story revolves around a Ouija board. I hate to even type or say those words. I will not and have not touched one since 1997. As previously stated, that was 22 years ago, making me 13 at the time. An age where I believe most of us start to branch out in curiosities. It's no longer just having sleepovers with friends, playing various video game consoles, or getting into high school sports. Girls were starting to become appealing. In my time, professional wrestling was starting to really take off. A group of my friends were driving into horror movies and scary movies. This is something that always appealed to me. Ever since reading scary stories to tell in the dark, I was hooked. This series of books came out when I was around 8 years old. They sold them at our Scholastic book fair. Looking back, these stories and illustrations were way too intense for 8-year-olds in my opinion, but I sure did enjoy them. We like being scared. We like to feel something more than the everyday mundane drudge of life. My friend Philly and I enjoyed getting together and watching horror movies and telling urban legends. We started doing this almost weekly, especially during the summer when school was out. Of course, this was pre-internet era, so all we had media-wise was actually renting a movie or physically going to the theater. And since most horror movies were R-rated, we couldn't see them. I'm sure to most millennials or post-millennials, this sounds like a nightmare scarier than any real-life story. Because we got tired of renting the same movies over and over, we often focused on urban legends, what we all call creepypastas today. We might find some books at the library that had them, or we just made our own up. At this time, we wanted to feel some actual terror. I wish we would have just stuck with our stupid, scary stories. I bet every group of friends had one of those Parker Brothers made board games stashed somewhere. The infamous Ouija board. This toy is simple. They even used to advertise it. A board with the alphabet numbers, yes, no, and goodbye. I suppose this was inevitable. Every kid has to learn for themselves that these are not to be played with, literally and metaphorically. Growing up in a God-fearing family, I knew this felt wrong. I felt this board wasn't right. I also could see through the marketing strategy that Parker Bros were selling these specifically to children, like all board games. But this was different. They wanted kids to play this only, not adults. You played Monopoly and Chutes and Ladders with your parents. You sure as hell didn't play the Ouija with them. I felt this was wrong, but I also didn't know anything. I was 13. My current 35-year-old self has a hard time understanding what happened and why I dove into this, knowing the outcome would not be ideal. I found it, my buddy Philly said, under my sister's bed. This was the start of a series of events that would haunt me for quite a while. It, of course, was the board. We made sure no one was home when we pulled it out. There was an air of mischief around this thing. Certainly we couldn't deal with his sister finding us in a room, and definitely not his mom finding out what we were up to. The board was glossy and new. It looked like we were possibly the first to use it. The device that 2 or more people used to glide over the board, revealing the answers to your questions, was almost ivory. I wanted to search what this was called, but I don't want to start down the rabbit hole online. If you've noticed, I don't want to call it by its name, simply referring to it as the board. I'll call the gliding thing the Oracle for this story. We had 2 sessions with the board. The first incident was free. We asked a few silly questions, what our future held, if we would get married and have kids, stuff like that. Even though I'd never played this before, I still knew not to ask questions like what was the name of the person we were talking to. Maybe we had gotten that from the hours of watching scary movies. The second session was when things got weird. Philly and I were going back and forth with the board, asking some simple questions about our future lives. I remember asking where I would live as an adult, and the board said Seattle. I lived 2,000 miles away from Seattle at the time, but this is where I felt the aura of the board shifted. It felt like a thunderstorm was brewing, one where the sky turned red. The oracle we used to piece out answers to our dumb questions had moved slowly before. Now it was jerking, almost moving off the board to the next letter. I can tell you this about the game. It is real, and neither one of us were moving the oracle. My hands weren't even on it at some points. But back to the Seattle question. I was and still am a huge baseball fan. I have rooted, unfortunately, for the Detroit Tigers for my entire life. The mid to late 90s was the explosion of Ken Griffey Jr. to Major League Baseball. I loved watching him play. I got his jerseys for a couple Christmases and birthdays. I'm sure that most know that Griffey played for the Seattle Mariners. I loved how that nautical S looked like on that teal uniform. I started researching the city of Seattle and thought how cool it would be to live there. Do you see where this is going? This board was not plastic and glue to me anymore. There was something controlling it. Something powerful and dark that knew I had this particular city on my mind at this time. I didn't let on to my buddy what I was feeling. He didn't seem to let on that he was afraid either, so we kept on. The next segment of questions is a blur to me. All I remember is the oracle going mostly to no when we asked a question, even if it wasn't a yes or no answer that was required. Then I asked the last question that I would ever ask the Ouija. Don't get your hopes up. It was nothing profound or deep at all. This is what I asked. Would the Detroit Tigers ever win another World Series? The oracle moved so fast to goodbye, I thought a tiny trail of fire would be on the board. I'll never forget looking at Philly and seeing what I'm sure was the exact same bulging eye, mouth open expression that I had on my own face. We knew that one of the rules of this game was when the board said goodbye, you put it away immediately. I think we even read that on the instructions. We threw the board into its box, hustled to his sister's room as fast as two Hostess cupcake and Mountain Dew-filled teenagers could. Philly chucked the board under her bed like nothing happened. After a few breathless moments, we finally started to let out tiny little laughs, lighting up into big belly laughs as we hit the floor rolling. We were laughing out of the nervousness, also kind of feeling dumb at how scared we got. After the madness finally started dying down, we moved on like nothing happened. I should have stated right from the start that it was late at night when we started playing. I would say it was about midnight, as cliche as that is. When the board said goodbye to us, it couldn't have been more than 100 hours in the morning. Philly lived in the country. Across the street was a cemetery. I know, I'm really hitting cliche territory, but I swear it's true. There weren't many houses around. If you wanted to walk to your next door neighbor, you better plan for a good 20-minute hike. Finally, all mania was shed, and tired from playing video games, we decided to step outside. We looked at the graveyard, noting how calm the night was. Philly had a large section of his yard covered with rose bushes. They were pretty wild and were not kept up. Needless to say, nothing would be able to get into those bushes and not get completely diced. We heard rustling. Again, the night was calm and I don't remember any wind at all. At first we could just hear the bushes, then we could hear movement. To this day I do not know and don't care to know what it was. It could have been a small animal, but I highly doubt it. We knew something wasn't right and bolted for his house. Even now writing this, I can feel an eerie presence. We both knew this was relating to the board. Philly suggested we make it a night and try to get some sleep. I wish that was the end of this story. A few short hours later, we were woken up to a series of faint knocking noises. I could not determine where they were coming from, but it sounded like it was somewhere outside his house. We both cautiously got up and moved to the kitchen, where his front door was. I slowly peeked outside and saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. A man, slight build, wearing all denim, was standing right outside the door. The man also had creepy-looking rimmed glasses on, outdated even for the late 90s. Philly had a porch in the front, and that was raised about 5 steps from the ground, and the man was on the ground. So when we saw him, we were actually looking slightly down at him, seeing him from the top of his head down. It is an image that is burned into my mind. He didn't move. He just stood there. We once again fled to his room and shut the door. We didn't call the police, or his mom. We just sat in his room, not sure what to do. After a few moments, we stupidly decided to see if he was still there. He was gone. I successfully convinced myself that there was no man on the side of the house. I just couldn't handle what was happening on this night. Philly did the same. Finally, day broke and we dismissed the disturbing events of the previous night. I don't even think we discussed what happened. About a week later, I got a call from Philly. He said he had a dream that we were playing the board and a hand came out and attempted to pull his head down. He awoke sweating and in a small amount of pain from where the force had grabbed him. I hated to say that I had a similar dream. Right there, we decided to meet up and do something about this board. My mom dropped me off at his house a few days later to sleep over for the night. When I arrived, I could not find him in his house. This was before cell phones, so I did not have the option to simply call him and see where he was. I checked out back where his garage was. There stood Philly, with the board sitting atop a pile of kindling in a burning barrel. His mischievous grin told me what his plan was. We lit that sucker on fire. Nothing happened. Now I was really freaking out. We've all heard stories of people attempting to burn a Ouija with no success. Philly wasn't fazed though. He pulled out a jerry can full of gasoline and doused it. The board lit up and quickly evaporated into nothing. It was over. As far as I can remember, nothing happened after that. We didn't speak of anything we experienced that night. Over the years, I chalked it up to an overreactive teenage imagination. I may have told a handful of people over the years, mainly just to tell a scary story. I know I've said this a few times, but I've completely treated this like it never happened. This, to me, was all imagined. We did play the game, but the rusting bush, the man, none of that happened. Over the years, I moved quite a distance away from Philly. We kept in touch a few times a year, even making the almost 1,000-mile drive to see him about 10 years ago. Fast forward 10 more years, and I decided to make the trip one last time to see my hometown and get together with Philly. He invited some people from the area and struck up a massive bonfire. In between bites of pizza and swigs of beer, I recounted the story of that night. I told him how I imagined the aftermath of our decision to use that board. I know you're going to think this is crazy, but I thought there was a man standing outside your house that night, I said. Philly looked at me, as stone cold as he could, and said, "Yeah, I remember that." My blood never went colder. My friend confirmed exactly what happened that night. It was like we were both there again, 22 years ago. I repressed that Ouija board so hard I made myself believe it never happened. The Ouija is nothing to be played with. I haven't touched or looked at one in over 2 decades. How a piece of cardboard can summon some kind of evil from another realm is beyond me. I just know you don't want to open it.